Welcome to Story Planet, where stories find you gently whenever you need a pause, a moment to breathe, or a quiet place to rest your thoughts. Today's tale isn't about where the road ends, but about the love that travels with us and the quiet strength found along the way. So whenever you're ready, settle in and come with us beneath desert skies. Morning gently broke over the quiet rural town of Willow Creek. Nestled comfortably among rolling green hills and peaceful farmlands, it was the early 1900s, more than 100 years ago, and the world was quietly changing. Railroads carved paths through once silent lands. Newspapers spoke of faraway cities shimmering with opportunity. And for men like Jacob Whitlow, the frontier still held promises wrapped in hardship. Soft rays of sunlight spilled across neatly tended gardens and modest timber homes, bathing everything in a warm golden glow. At the edge of town, Jacob stood thoughtfully beside the old oak gate of his farmhouse, silently absorbing every familiar sight and sound. His children laughing softly near the apple orchard, his wife Sarah tending carefully to rows of fragrant herbs, and distant hills wrapped in a thin veil of early morning mist. Today marked the beginning of Jacob's journey to the western deserts of New Mexico, a journey that would last over 3 years, driven by sacrifice, love, and the quiet hope of securing a better future for the people who meant the world to him. The harvests in Willow Creek had been poor for nearly 2 seasons. Rain came late or not at all, and the soil had grown tired. Beyond the borders of their small town, the world was shifting. Old ways were giving way to new uncertainties. Factories were rising in cities, trade routes were tightening, and whispers of unrest in far-off lands stirred caution in the hearts of everyday folk. Though no one could name it yet, a tension was brewing in the air, one that made jobs scarce and prices high, tightening the belt of every working family across the country. Farming alone could no longer sustain a family of 4, and rail work was dwindling. But there was news. Ranching outfits in the Southwest were hiring strong men to tend cattle, sheep, and imported camels, which had recently been brought in to test their endurance on the dry frontiers. The work offered steady wages and basic provisions, though it came at the cost of comfort, grueling sun-scorched days, isolation, and endless tasks under wide, unforgiving skies. Jacob saw in this opportunity a lifeline, one last chance to ensure his family wouldn't face another winter counting potatoes in the cellar. He had never been farther west than Kansas, but letters from a cousin who had worked briefly in the desert painted a life of long days, dry winds, and sunburned hands. Still, there was honor in hard work, and Jacob had never turned away from labor. He knelt down beside his young daughter, Emily, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her wide eyes met his with a curious innocence, her hands tightly clutching her beloved cloth bear. "Daddy, will you be gone very long?" Emily asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Only until you grow just a bit taller," Jacob replied gently, offering her a reassuring smile. He leaned forward, placing a tender kiss on her forehead. "Promise me you'll help take care of your mom." Emily nodded bravely, doing her best to hold back tears. Her older brother Luke stepped forward and tugged gently at Jacob's sleeve. "Will you tell us stories about the desert, Dad?" Luke asked with a hopeful grin. Jacob smiled warmly, placing a hand gently atop Luke's shoulder. "Of course, son, stories, and maybe even some hidden treasures. I'll bring back more than you can imagine." Sarah approached quietly, her gentle expression bathed in the soft morning light. She stood silently beside Jacob for a moment, her gaze speaking volumes. Between them flowed memories, silent conversations, and dreams built on quiet evenings spent talking beneath star-filled skies. Without a word, she handed Jacob a carefully wrapped cloth filled with biscuits baked the night before, and dried apples from last autumn's yield, small comforts for the lonely roads ahead. "Please be careful," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of restrained emotions. 3 years is a long time. We'll all be here, counting the days. Jacob took her hands gently into his own, his touch steady and comforting. "My heart stays right here with you, Sarah. Every mile, every day. It's all for us, for a future where the kids can read by lamplight, and we never again skip meals to save money." With a final lingering look, Jacob slowly turned, feeling the gentle tug of sadness mixed with quiet determination. His boots crunched softly along the dirt path as the sights of his beloved home grew smaller behind him, eventually disappearing into the distance. Ahead lay a long road, stretching toward endless horizons, deserts filled with sand and sun, and vast open skies that would soon become his new world. The journey was long and layered in silence. Jacob boarded a westbound train, one of the old coal-fired models that rattled like thunder across dry plains. He rode with farmers, drifters, and a few young men with hopeful eyes and dusty hats. The conversations were quiet, often spoken with pipe smoke and long pauses. As the train climbed through unfamiliar land, Jacob stared through soot-smeared windows, watching the earth shift from green to gold to red. When the train could go no further, he continued by wagon, and eventually horseback, miles folding into memory, blisters into calluses. The silence of the desert stunned him at first. It was not empty, but vast. Days began before dawn, and nights belonged to coyotes and stars. At last, he reached the ranch near the borderlands, a sparse camp with canvas tents, stone troughs, and rugged men hardened by wind and sun. Nights in the desert were unlike any he'd known. After long days of walking under a blistering sun, Jacob found solace beneath endless stars, wrapped in a worn blanket. The work was relentless, tending to animals that never rested, building new fencing in dust storms, hauling feed and water under scorching skies. Yet in the rhythm of labor, he found something grounding. There was a quiet dignity in sweat-earned wages. Each evening, after the tools were stowed and the animals settled, Jacob would sit by the flickering light of a lantern, fingers stained with dust, heart swollen with longing. He wrote letters to Sarah and the children, pressing pencil to paper with a tenderness that surprised even him. He described the vastness of the sky, the strength of the animals, the beauty of silence, and he tucked in his love between the lines. Once a month, these letters traveled east with the supply wagons, bound for Willow Creek, and though he never said it aloud, every now and then he wept quietly into the collar of his work shirt, tears born not of weakness, but of deep, patient love, love that stretched across miles and years and grew stronger, not weaker, with time. As Jacob drew closer to the rhythm of life on the ranch, anticipation mixed gently with resolve. He wasn't chasing fortune, he was building a foundation, one made not of gold or land, but of intention. He imagined Emily reading from the Bible by lamplight, Luke helping Sarah carry firewood, their pantry full, their lives steady, and laughter echoing again through the orchard. Under a sky brushed with the last light of day, Jacob pressed forward. His journey was just beginning, yet he felt deeply changed already, guided by memory, fueled by hope, and tethered always to love. He stepped into the vast sunlit unknown, carrying with him everything that truly mattered. The desert summer arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar, dry, scorching, and relentless. It swept through the land with heat that clung to the skin like ash, sun that showed no mercy, and silence so deep it became a sound of its own. For Jacob, the first full season away from home was both a physical trial and a quiet reckoning. Each day began long before the sun broke the horizon. At 4:30, the rusted triangle bell rang through the ranch like a command, shaking sleep from tired bones. Jacob would rise from his cot, body stiff from the previous day's labor, boots powdered with the fine dust that never left the floor. He'd splash his face with lukewarm water from the tin basin, wipe the sweat from his brow even before the sun was fully up, and don his wide-brimmed hat, now sun-bleached and soft at the edges. The desert was already awake, buzzing with insects, rustling with wind, and stretching endlessly in every direction. By sunrise, the men were already at work. Jacob moved among camels and cattle, troughs and tools, navigating the silence of animals who did not care for sympathy. The camels were stoic but unpredictable, creatures that tested his patience and slowly earned his respect. He learned their temperaments, their pacing, their habits in heat. They were not to be rushed. They demanded calm, quiet, and consistency. The days were long, the kind of long that made your back ache before noon and your throat feel like cracked leather by early afternoon. Heat waves shimmered on the horizon. The ground cracked beneath his boots, and sweat painted his shirt with dark, salty maps. Yet Jacob never uttered a word of complaint. He moved with purpose. His silence was steady, not sullen, carved from years of enduring, of doing what needed to be done. During short breaks, the men gathered in slivers of shade. They sipped tin mugs of weak coffee, swapped stories in low voices, and shared pipe smoke that rose lazily in the sweltering air. Some men were barely more than boys, hopeful, eager, still polishing their dreams. Others were worn thin by life, with eyes that had seen too many summers. Jacob mostly listened. He wasn't unfriendly, just quiet, measured. The others respected that. They called him Steady Jake. When the work slowed in the evenings, Jacob returned to the small trunk that held his most personal possessions: a tattered Bible, a carved wooden bird Emily had given him, and a slim leather notebook. That notebook became his lifeline. He wrote almost every evening just after supper. Under the flicker of the lantern, he'd scribble lines to Sarah, short stories to the children, tiny observations from the land around him. His letters were full of ordinary things: lizards sunning on rocks, dust devils dancing across the plain, the way a certain cloud reminded him of their porch swing. "Dear Sarah," he wrote, "the wind came strong today, but it carried your voice, I swear it. I thought I heard you humming, and for a moment I just closed my eyes and let it carry me." To Emily, he described a calf that had been born that morning. To Luke, he detailed the way he fixed a stubborn saddle strap using only one nail and a strip of hide. Sometimes he tucked a tiny flower or a soft feather inside the letter, something the desert had offered without asking anything in return. Once a month, the supply wagon headed east, and Jacob handed off his bundled letters with quiet reverence. It was a ritual, a release, a way to reach across the miles, but even with the letters, the loneliness came. It came at night. When the wind died down, when the sky was so full of stars it felt heavy, Jacob would lie on his back and stare upward, hands behind his head, boots still on. He would think of Sarah's face in lamplight, the sound of the children's feet on the wooden floors, the creak of the front door as he returned from the field. He thought of home like a prayer, and sometimes, without intending to, he would whisper their names aloud, just to hear them again. The ranch foreman, Briggs, was a man of strict rules and slow nods. He wasn't cruel, just seasoned. He respected order and effort. Twice a day he rode the outer fence lines, eyes sharp beneath his weathered hat. "Don't let the land fool you," he once told Jacob. "She's beautiful, but she bites if you turn your back." Jacob never turned his back. He worked steadily, mending, lifting, herding, hauling. He earned his sleep. He earned his calluses. He earned the quiet nod Briggs gave him each evening. And through it all, he carried his family. Not in photos, he had none. Not in keepsakes, they were too fragile for this place. But in his bones, in his breath, in the rhythm of his days. One night, a storm rolled in from the west. The clouds built slowly, like a wave preparing to crash. The wind howled through the camp, snapping canvas and rattling lanterns. Rain came hard and fast, soaking everything, carving rivulets into the hard-packed ground. The men gathered under the mess tent, voices raised over the roar. Some cursed, some laughed. Jacob sat quietly, watching the water fall, thinking of the porch back home, the way Sarah would lean against the doorframe and watch the rain. That night, he wrote, "The storm came through fierce, but it smelled like memory, like a long-forgotten evening in late July." By midsummer, Jacob had changed. His face was darker, lined by sun and time. His hands were cracked, his back ached more than it didn't. But his spirit was not broken. He had found a rhythm in the dust, a kind of clarity in the silence. He still missed home with an ache so deep it sometimes caught him by surprise. But he knew with certainty that every swing of the hammer, every length of fence, every letter written by lantern light was a thread in the bridge he was building back to them. And though the desert stretched wide and the nights were long, Jacob held tight to a promise. One summer at a time, he would find his way home. Autumn came to the desert in silence. There were no turning leaves, no harvest feasts or fireside cider, but something shifted, softly, subtly. The wind, once harsh and dry, now carried cooler edges at dusk. Shadows stretched longer. The animals grew stiller. The sun dipped earlier behind the ridges. Even in a place so far removed from home, Jacob could feel the season changing. It was the second season away, and he had begun to measure time not in weeks or months, but in letters. He had received Sarah's reply in the last supply run, a packet of pages tied with ribbon, her handwriting looping and familiar. He had held it in his hands like it was made of gold. He didn't read it all at once. Instead, he savored it, one page per night by lantern glow. The children had drawn little pictures in the corners. Emily's house with a chimney taller than its walls, Luke's clumsy horses that looked more like dogs. Sarah's words were steady, kind, and full of strength. "We are well," she wrote. "Your mother sends her love. The barn roof has held through 2 storms. The children miss you, though they've stopped asking when you'll return. They mark it instead by candle count." Jacob smiled at that, and cried a little too. Candle count. That evening he sat under a violet sky and lit one himself. Just one for them. The ranch quieted in autumn. The worst heat had passed. The nights were gentler. Work still stretched from dawn to dusk, but everything slowed by half a breath. The men grew quieter too. Some left, work hands that chased better pay elsewhere. Others stayed, including Jacob. He didn't chase anything but the calendar, and a home 1,000 miles away. He wrote more now. His letters grew longer, more reflective. He no longer wrote only what he saw, but what he remembered and what he hoped. He wrote about the way Sarah's hair curled near her ears when the air was damp, about the sound of Luke's laughter when he was chasing the chickens, about Emily's little songs, the ones she made up when she didn't know he was listening. He began his entries with softer tones. Dear Sarah, the stars were bright again tonight. They made me think of the lanterns you hang for the fall festival. Remember last year, when the wind blew one into the pond? You laughed so hard you fell back in the grass. I still hear it. Each letter became a stitched square in a quilt of memory and longing. They weren't just messages, they were anchors. Sometimes he didn't even send them. He folded them gently and tucked them in a small tin box he kept hidden beneath his cot. They were for his return. He imagined handing them to Sarah one day, reading them aloud beside the fire, letting time melt slowly away with each word. Briggs noticed the change in Jacob. You write more now. The foreman remarked one morning as they repaired a broken gate. Good. Writing keeps a man sane. Jacob nodded. It keeps me home, even while I'm here. Briggs gave a knowing grunt. Ain't no shame in that. As the season pressed on, storms came more often. Rain that turned dust to clay, wind that cut colder in the night. Jacob huddled in his blanket and reread Sarah's words, holding them close to his chest. In one letter, Sarah described how Emily had taken to helping with the laundry, folding shirts too wide and pairing the wrong socks. She insists they match in spirit, Sarah had written with a smiley face. Jacob laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes with a catch in the throat. He could see her so clearly, his little girl, too small for the wash basin, too big in heart to care. The moon grew larger through October. The sky darkened earlier. Jacob began to feel the pull of time. He marked each week with a stone near the barn fence, one small rock stacked atop another. It became a ritual. He said nothing about it to the others. It was his own quiet calendar. Each stone, a week survived. Each letter, a piece of himself sent home. One night, after all the work was done and the fire was low, one of the younger men asked, "What keeps you out here, Jake?" Jacob stared into the flames for a while before answering. "Love," he said simply. "That's it. Just love." Autumn passed slowly, softly. It was a season of endurance, but also of remembering. And as Jacob wrapped himself tighter in his blanket each night, he did not count the miles. He counted the words, the letters, the hope tucked inside every page. And he believed with each sentence, with each quiet night, he was getting closer. Winter did not arrive with snow in the desert, but with silence. There was no frost on rooftops, no white-draped branches, no children's boots crunching in the yard. Instead, winter slipped into the desert with cold breath and longer nights, cloaking the land in a brittle stillness that clung to the skin and lived in the bones. The wind no longer danced through the grasses. It cut, sharper than any blade. Jacob had felt many winters back in Willow Creek, the kind that came with chimney smoke, soup on the stove, and children's laughter echoing through warm rooms. This was not that kind of winter. This was a season that tested not just the body, but the spirit. The camp changed. The men spoke less, they moved slower. The days began in half-light and ended in dusk. Every task, mending fence wire, guiding livestock, hauling feed, demanded more from muscles that had already given too much. Jacob's fingers cracked and bled. His knuckles stiff from cold. He rubbed them with balm at night, watching the skin heal over just in time to tear again. But he said nothing. Complaints were luxuries. And this place had no room for luxury. Instead, he endured. He woke before the bell now, out of habit more than necessity. He'd light the stove in the mess tent before anyone else arrived, hands wrapped around a tin mug of bitter coffee, steam rising in ghostly ribbons. One morning, Briggs came in early too. "You sleep at all?" the foreman asked, not unkindly. "Enough," Jacob replied, voice low. Briggs studied him for a beat. "You're more stubborn than most." Jacob didn't smile, but he didn't disagree. By midwinter, storms became unpredictable. Sudden rains turned pathways to mud. Windstorms tore loose canvas covers and scattered supplies like paper. One night, lightning split the sky so violently the cattle broke through the north pen. Men scrambled with lanterns, shouting through rain and thunder, boots sinking into soaked ground. Jacob didn't hesitate. He moved fast, roping and guiding in the dark, shoulder to shoulder with Briggs and two others. By dawn, the animals were safe. The damage contained. No one said much, but over breakfast, Briggs laid a hand on Jacob's shoulder, a silent recognition. That morning, Jacob wrote in his notebook, "We held the line even when the sky tried to tear it down." He folded the page and added it to the others in his tin box. Not every letter was sent. Some were meant for later, for reading aloud by the fire, for remembering. Sarah's last letter had arrived 2 weeks prior. It had been shorter than usual, the writing smaller. She had fallen ill, she said, a cough that wouldn't let go. The doctor wasn't concerned, but it had made the days harder. Emily had taken over baking. Luke was chopping wood on his own now. Jacob read the letter twice, then again. He held it close, tucked it into his coat pocket, and walked out into the wind. The worry stayed with him. He couldn't do anything from here. He could only keep going, keep writing, keep believing that love, like a thread, held them all together. One night, near the end of January, Jacob fell ill. It began as a chill in his spine, then fever, then a cough deep in his chest. He tried to work through it, but Briggs ordered him to rest. For 2 days, Jacob lay under wool blankets, sweating and shaking. Another hand, Davis, brought him broth and water. Jacob barely spoke. He dreamed of home, of the children's laughter, Sarah's hand on his forehead, a fire crackling in the hearth. He woke with tears on his cheeks and the faintest whisper on his lips. "Not yet. Not yet." He recovered slowly. By the first week of February, he was moving again, slower, leaner, but upright. The work waited as it always did. And Jacob returned to it without fanfare. The men nodded as he passed, respect unspoken, but deeply felt. There was a quiet fire inside him now, a deeper resolve. He had survived another season, and with each swing of the hammer, each step along the frozen path, he felt closer. Not in miles, but in meaning. Winter did not bring him home, but it shaped him and showed him the way. Spring returned to the desert like a breath held too long, and finally released. The sky softened. The wind carried warmth instead of warning. Tiny blooms peeked through cracks in the sand. Morning light returned earlier, with a golden hue that spoke not of survival, but of renewal. Jacob stood at the edge of the pen, watching the camels shift and stir in the early light. The winter behind him had left its mark, lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, a deeper quiet in his gaze. But beneath it all, something stirred. Hope. It had been 3 years. 3 years of dust and letters, of sunrises over fences and stars over canvas, of longing softened only by memory and routine. Now at last it was time to go home. The ranch had fulfilled its need. The last of the herds were moving to higher ground. New hands were arriving. The season of return had come. Briggs had met him with a nod the day before. "You've earned more than your keep, Whitlow. You'll be missed." Jacob tipped his hat. "And I'll remember this place, even when I don't feel it in my bones anymore." He packed slowly. There was no rush. Every item held a story. The carved bird Emily had given him now had worn edges. The Bible was filled with letters and folded pages and ribbon markers. The notebook was thick with ink and dreams. He folded his old coat with care, wrapped the tin box of unsent letters in cloth, and placed them at the top of the trunk. These weren't just things. They were the pieces of the man who had weathered 3 seasons of sun and silence. Before he left, he walked the fence line one last time. The air smelled of dust and sage. A jackrabbit darted through the scrub. He paused at the final post, rested his hand on the worn wood, and whispered, "Thank you." The journey home was slow and filled with wonder. Jacob traveled by wagon first, sitting with a trader who told stories of mountain valleys and river towns. Then by rail, through canyons, over plains, past towns he barely remembered. At each stop he stepped down to stretch his legs and bought something small. A red scarf for Sarah, soft, woven, like something she might wear to Sunday church. A harmonica for Luke, though he wasn't sure if the boy still liked music. A notebook for Emily, with a pressed flower tucked inside. And sweets, wrapped in paper, honey candies and cinnamon sticks, the kind children remember long after the flavor fades. The towns grew greener. Trees returned to the landscape. The scent of spring deepened. Jacob watched fields roll by and imagined Willow Creek just beyond the next hill and the next, until it was real. When he arrived at the small station, dusk had already brushed the sky with lavender and peach. He stepped down slowly. No one else got off. The platform was quiet, but she was there. Sarah. She stood at the edge of the gravel, hands folded, eyes wide, still as the breeze. Her hair had silver threads now, and her frame was thinner. But her eyes, those eyes were exactly as he had remembered. Jacob removed his hat. The distance between them felt like a breath held too long. Then she smiled, and he stepped forward. She met him halfway. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply held each other. He breathed in the scent of her hair, felt her heartbeat, and let the 3 years fall away like dust shaken from a coat. "I brought you something," he whispered. Sarah laughed through tears. "You brought yourself. That's all I ever wanted." Later, the children came running. Luke was taller than Jacob remembered, broad-shouldered now. Emily's hair was longer, and she wore a ribbon that matched the color of the sky. They hugged him with the energy only children can carry. He held them close, eyes closed, memorizing everything. That night, they sat on the porch, candles flickering on the railing. Jacob told stories of desert wind and stubborn camels. Emily curled against his side, notebook in hand. Luke played the harmonica softly. Sarah sat beside him, her hand in his. And for the first time in years, Jacob didn't feel the pull of the horizon. Only the pull of home. He would work the land again. He would fix the barn roof. He would wake to bird song instead of the clanging of a triangle bell. He would grow old beside her. And when the wind returned in summer, he would let it blow through the orchard, not through his bones. Jacob knew not every season would be easy, but this one, this spring, was a beginning. The letters he had written, those he had sent and those he hadn't, were now bound in a box tucked beneath the bed. Emily would one day read them. Luke might too. Sarah already knew every word by heart. As the candles burned low, Jacob looked out at the trees beyond the fence line, the moon high and kind. He exhaled slowly and smiled because he had made it, because everything he'd hoped for was here. And now, as the stars begin to settle and the quiet returns to your room, let your breath slow, just like Jacob's journey home. May you feel the peace of spring on your skin, the warmth of love wrapped around your heart, and the gentle promise that every road, no matter how long, always leads back to where we belong. Sleep well, dream soft, and remember, you are never far from home.